This next video is a comprehensive tutorial discussing the 11th use case in Bethany Lyons' top 15 LOD expressions. And this 11th use case is where we compare the average value across a range to a certain value anywhere in our chart. Let's go ahead and start by downloading the sample workbook that comes with this white paper. If we scroll down, we should be able to see a way for us to download this white paper. So right here. Let's quickly review what this dashboard shows. So in here, we can set our own start and end dates, and that's going to be shown on screen as a reference band. What we want to do is we want to be able to take the daily values within this range, get a number, and compare that number against any daily values that we're seeing for the rest of the chart. So for this particular example, this is from February 1st, 2014 to June 1st, 2014. The average daily value in here is $6.19. So for this particular example, we want to compare this value to the value in July 3, 2013, which is $10.23. So essentially, what we want to do is we want to take our $10.23, subtract that with 6.19, and figure out what the percent difference is. And to do that, we want to divide the result with 619, and that should yield us 65%. Note that all of these values pertain to a single stock ticker. Let's go to one of the worksheets. We can click on the View Data icon in our sidebar. Let's open this up, and let's sort this by the ticker values. Let's take a look at the ticker FIRE. What we're seeing in here is for every date, for every day, there is only a single value. So for example, one value for December 31st, 2012, one value for January 2, one value for January 3. Let's go ahead and download the original data source. Let's use that in a brand new workbook so we can recreate what is being demonstrated in this example. And in here, there should be an option for us to export the data to a CSV file. So let's go ahead and do that. So right-click, Export to CSV, Migrated Data, and let's call this Ticker Data. Let's use this new data source now in a new workbook. And let us start by creating a simple line chart with reference lines from February 1st, 2014 to June 1st, 2014. And this is specific to a stock ticker, and this one is selecting VDSI. Create our line chart. Let's right-click, drag date onto column. So right-click, drag, selecting continuous date at the very top. Click on OK. This generates our date axis for us. And then let's display our adjusted close. Drag that over to rows. This is our very simple line chart. Now we also want to show this per stock ticker, so we can add our ticker to our filters. Right-click on ticker in your sidebar, show filter. I'm simply going to move this underneath the marks card to save a little bit of space. And we can also change this to a single value list. So on the top right corner, there's an arrow. We're going to select single value dropdown, and let us select VDSI. Now let's add our reference band, and we can start by adding our two date parameters. So in your sidebar on the dropdown, create parameter. The first one, let's call this start date. This is a date field, and the current value is 2014. And this is February 1st. So February 1st. Click OK. Now we can create a second parameter by duplicating the first parameter because they're very similar anyway. So right click, duplicate. And then for the second one, we're going to change the name and we're going to change the default value. So let's click on edit. Let's call this end date. And the value for this will be June. So June 1st. Select June 1, click OK. Let's now display both of these parameters. So control click, and then right click to show the parameter. So those are our two values right now. In our analytics tab in your sidebar, we can select a reference band. So drag over the reference band, and in here, we want to make sure we are targeting the date and not the whole table, not the adjusted close. So it's going to be the date. And as we make adjustments to the reference line, we should be able to see the visual update real time. For example, we want the band to be coming from the start date, and we can see the shaded area get adjusted. Let's make sure this goes all the way to the end date as well. So on the drop down, end date, and we're simply not going to display any labels. So in here right now, it's set to computation. We're just going to leave this as blank. So on the drop down, none. For the label on the drop down, none. I'm just going to make some adjustments with the grid lines. We're going to remove the grid lines for now. So under Format, Lines, we're going to select the grid lines to none. For this demo, let's also add one more reference line just so we can easily see what number we're comparing to the average number of the range we're comparing to. By default, we are going to set this reference line to July 3, 2013. So let's add our third date parameter. So on the dropdown in your sidebar, create parameter. Let's call this selected date. Selected date. This is going to be a date value again, and this is going to be set for 2013 July 3. So 2013, I'm going to change this to July and July 3. Click on OK. Now let's call this first worksheet our chart. Now before moving forward, what I'd like to do is to display all the details so that we know exactly what numbers we're trying to get. So let's create another worksheet. This time around, we're just going to call this details, and this is just for reference, just so we can validate the numbers that we're actually getting. So for the details, let's display the ticker, and we're going to simply leave VDSI. So right click, keep only. We're also going to display each individual date. So right click, drag date. And we are going to select discrete date because we simply want to display this as a column of values. And we're also going to display adjusted close. So let's drag that over to text. Now in here, note that each of these individual values, although it's coming in as the sum of sales, it's really just a single value because right underneath in our data source, there is only a single record per day per ticker. To confirm this, we can simply click on one of these values, go to view data, and in the full data tab, we should be able to see that there's only a single value. So even though we are showing sum of adjusted close, it is really just one adjusted close. To help us with our validation, I'm going to create a calculated field that limits the data to the selected values in our parameters. So on the dropdown, I'm going to create a calculated field, simply going to call this within date. And again, this is just for checking purposes. And in here, we're simply going to check if the date is greater than or equal to our start date, and our date is also less than or equal to our end date. So drag that over, end date. By the way, in here, all of these white spaces, it's mostly for readability. It's not going to affect your expressions. So we can simply add some white spaces as well to make our expressions more readable. So let's click on OK, and let's add this new field into our filter. So in here, only the ones that are within the selected date range should appear. And the reason we want to do it this way is we want to add our totals. Again, this is only for checking purposes. Under the Analytics tab, we can double click on totals. And in here, we can see the grand total at the very bottom. This is the grand sum. So let's move this up first. So right click on grand total, column totals to the top. And what we want to do is to display not the sum, but the average of all of these values. And we can do that here by clicking on our measure, selecting total using, and instead of total using automatic, we're going to say total using average. So drop down, total using average. And now what we're seeing in here is 6.186, which should be the same value we are seeing from the original example. So how do we convert this into an LOD expression? Right now, what we know is we want to base this expression on a ticker. So it's going to be fixed to a ticker. Now, what we also know is this has to be only within a specific range of values and that it's going to be the average of the daily values. So let's try to compose this LOD expression. So on the dropdown, create calculated field. Let's call this average across range. Let's say per ticker. This is going to be fixed to a ticker, so fixed ticker. And we also know that this needs to be within a range of values. So we basically have to say if date is greater than or equal to our start date and date is less than or equal to our end date. If this is true, then what we want to show is our adjusted close. So drag adjusted close over and then end our if-else statement. So let's close this with our closing curly brace. Now there's a couple adjustments we can make. The first error is because our level of detail expressions, it requires an aggregated value, but our adjusted close, that's not an aggregation. So we are going to need to enclose this or encapsulate this in an aggregate function. In our case, we know that this needs to be an average. So we can simply put average around this whole expression. So AVG, and then put the whole expression in here. Just make this a little bit bigger so we can see the full expression. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get all of the individual values and we're trying to average that out. And we can see that the calculation is now valid. Now, the other adjustment we can do is this expression is already in another calculated field. So if you have this other calculated field, you can simply use that or utilize that in this LOD expression. So in our case, I'm simply going to remove this and use within date. So if it is within the valid date, then we're simply going to display the adjusted close and we're going to pass all of those values into an average value. So let's click on apply, click on OK. Let's just validate what number does this return. So dragging that over into our text table, we can see that the value is consistently 6.186. Let's go back to the first sheet. Now I also want to add our reference line for our selected date, and let's also display that parameter control. So right click on selected date, show parameter. This is our default value, July 3, 2013. Let's go to the analytics tab, drag a reference line over. And again, this is going to be attached to a date. And let's display the parameter value here. So parameter value, selected date, and we can just display perhaps our value here. So that's July 3, 2013, and let's click on OK. Now I'm going to add one more calculated field that gives me the value at this day. So in here, let's create a calculated field. On the drop down, create calculated field. Let's call this selected value on date. And let's simply say this is if the selected date is equivalent to the date, then we just simply want the adjusted close. So adjusted close and then end. So let's display this value on the label. We can see that this is 1023, which is the same value that we see from the original workbook. Now, just for reference, let's add our average across range onto our title as well so we can easily see it. So under chart, double click our title. Let's just call this average across selected range. And let's display this value. So average across selected range, let's click on apply. It's 6.186. Now we have a lot of the pieces we need in place. What we need is this value for the selected range. We want the average value across the selected range. And in here, we're simply going to subtract these values divided by our 6.186. So we can generate a calculated field for that. So on the drop down, create calculated field. Let's call this percent difference from selected range. Let's move things around. For the expression, it's going to be the selected value. This is already in our canvas, so we can simply drag it over, and that's going to be minus the average across the range. And in here, we want to take this and divide this all by the average across range. So let's put a bracket around the first expression, scroll to the right, and then divide this by the average across range. Okay, let's click on OK. Let's change the formatting, right click drag, default properties. This is going to be number format. Let's leave this as percentage, 2 decimal places, and let's display this as well in our label. So right now, the value that we're seeing is 65.38%. And again, just to compare with the original workbook, we are getting the correct result, which is 65%. We can definitely make adjustments to our formatting now, but the important thing is a lot of the pieces are in place. This is fairly dynamic. So if we change the date for whatever reason, so let's say January 1st, 2014, we can see that the selected range average actually adjusts as well. And our percent difference, if we select a different value altogether, it will just automatically update.